The stars above Erevo's colony glittered with a beauty that often made settlers forget how fragile life among them truly was. But on this night, the silence of space carried a darker promise for something unseen was approaching from beyond the void, something that would change the destiny of humanity forever. Commander Rin was on the observation deck when the first warning alarms flickered through the station. Corridors, faint red lights pulsing like a heartbeat, as if the colony itself sensed the danger before the people did. And he knew immediately that this was not a drill, because the comms channels buzzed with static rather than clear orders, a detail too deliberate to be an accident, as though someone had severed their ability to call for help. Families below in the city dome carried on with their evening routines, children playing by the artificial lakes, traders closing their shops, and scientists preparing their nightly data reports, all unaware of the shadow falling over them. In the darkness beyond the planet's orbit, an armada of ships drifted silently, their hulls reflecting no light, their engines whispering rather than roaring, and the Dralith Dominion, feared yet rarely seen, revealed itself at last, striking not with warning but with precision, unleashing bursts of energy that shattered orbital defenses before anyone could react. The shields collapsing like fragile glass as debris rained into the upper atmosphere, streaking like falling stars across the colony's skies, leaving onlookers frozen between awe and terror. In the command center, officers scrambled, pressing controls that no longer responded, watching as every defensive turret fell silent, as if the entire system had been disabled in a single instant. And Rin's voice cut through the chaos, commanding his crew to evacuate civilians, though in his heart he knew there would be no true escape, for the Dominion's reputation was clear. They did not invade, they erased, and once their fleets arrived, nothing survived. Panic swept through the streets as evacuation sirens wailed, parents clutching their children, shuttles overloading as people fought to board, though most already sensed that no shuttle would outrun the fire falling from the skies. Explosions rocked the city dome as energy blasts struck in deliberate sequence, buildings collapsing into ash while shock waves rolled through the air, glass shattering into glittering rain, and still the Dominion ships remained eerily silent. Not a single broadcast, not a word of explanation, only destruction. Rin's crew reported that neighboring colonies Halcyon and Vega Prime had gone dark just minutes earlier. Their signals cut at the same moment Erebos came under attack, and it was then the commander realized with chilling certainty that this was not a battle but a purge coordinated and merciless, meant to extinguish entire branches of humanity in a single sweep. As fire consumed the city and desperate cries echoed across comms, Rin made his final decision, transmitting a coded burst toward Earth, one that carried no words but only raw data, the coordinates of the Dominion fleet, the evidence of what had been done, and the warning that more was coming, though he doubted it would arrive in time. His last sight through the observation deck's shattered glass was the Dominion flagship, a monstrous silhouette dwarfing even the largest of Earth's dreadnoughts, its presence alone enough to drown hope, and as it fired a single beam that pierced the colony's core reactor, a white flash brighter than dawn spread across the horizon, consuming towers, rivers, and mountains in a single breath, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. When the light faded, Erebos was gone, wiped from maps and memory as though it had never existed, and in the deep quiet that followed, the Dominion ships turned and vanished back into the stars, leaving behind only fragments drifting in the void. Across the galaxy, the first whispers spread, uncertain and fearful, that humanity had been struck not by misfortune or natural disaster, but by deliberate extermination. And though no one yet understood why the Dralith had chosen this path, one truth began to settle in the minds of those who listened. The peace humanity had built was broken, and the storm had only just begun. On Earth, The transmission from Commander Rin arrived fractured and incomplete, its signal distorted by distance and interference. Yet the raw fragments were enough to send shockwaves through the halls of the global assembly, for within the broken data were images of shattered colonies, drifting wreckage, and the terrifying silhouette of the Dominion flagship, a sight that froze the room into silence. Leaders and diplomats stared at the screens, disbelief in their eyes. For Erebos, Halcyon, and Vega Prime had been thriving centers of trade and research only days ago, and now they were gone, erased as if they had never existed, leaving behind no survivors and no explanation. And in that silence, humanity found itself confronted with a truth it had long tried to ignore. Peace was fragile, and trust in the Galactic Council, which had sworn to protect member civilizations, might not be enough to shield them from extinction. Outside the assembly chambers, word spread quickly through the public networks, and soon the entire planet buzzed with grief and outrage, as memorial walls filled with the names of lost families, while vigils were held in cities across continents, candles flickering against the night sky as voices demanded answers. People asked why the Council had remained silent, why no fleets had been dispatched to intervene, and why humanity, despite its contribution to galactic trade and defense, now stood alone in its hour of need. But the Council's response when it came was colder than expected, for they issued a statement that dismissed the attacks as regrettable consequences of unchecked expansion, suggesting that humanity's spread into frontier systems had provoked the Dominion, and thus the responsibility lay not with the attackers, but with the victims themselves, and this betrayal struck deeper than the destruction itself, igniting a fury that spread through Earth like wildfire. Among the grieving crowds were those who remembered humanity's history of resilience. Veterans of past wars who whispered that Earth had once been underestimated before and had risen stronger each time, scientists who reminded others that human adaptability had no equal, and engineers who quietly reopened sealed archives of abandoned defense projects, long buried under the promise of peace but never truly forgotten. In hidden hangars, ancient warships were dragged from storage, their outdated hulls soon to be reforged with new alloys, while in laboratories the Adaptive War Network, a forbidden AI capable of learning strategies faster than any fleet, was reactivated, its deep hum echoing like a heartbeat in the dark. Ordinary citizens, too, began to transform, volunteers filling training camps, pilots returning to their simulators, and families who had lost everything pledging themselves to the cause, for if no one else would defend them, then humanity would rise as its own guardian. Yet, as the preparations unfolded, tension grew, for some still clung to the belief that appealing to the Council might prevent war, while others argued that no words could undo genocide, and that waiting for permission would only invite more attacks, a divide that nearly fractured the assembly until the transmission from Erebos was replayed once more, this time enhanced, to reveal Rin's final gesture. The coordinates of the Dominion fleet burned into the data stream, undeniable proof of where the enemy had struck from, and with that knowledge the debate ended, for the evidence left no room for doubt. The Dominion had acted with intent, and only action could answer them. Still, questions lingered in every mind. If the Dominion was so powerful, why strike only 3 colonies? Why not Earth itself? And what greater plan lay hidden behind the sudden slaughter? And it was these questions that kept leaders awake at night, knowing that the truth might be more terrifying than what they had already witnessed. On the streets, whispers turned into chants, chants into marches, and soon entire cities thundered with one demand: justice. Not words, not excuses, but a response that would show the galaxy that humanity would not be erased quietly. Across the stars, other species watched in silence, some pitying, some fearful, for they had seen this before with civilizations that had resisted the Dominion only to vanish in time, but none had ever seen the spark that now burned in humanity's eyes, a spark that promised something different, something relentless. And though the council dismissed it as empty defiance, those who knew human history recognized that this was no passing fury, but the awakening of a storm, one that, once unleashed, would not rest until balance was restored. As Earth's skies filled with the thunder of engines, as prototypes lifted from hangars and recruits marched in formation, a single thought resonated across the planet. Unspoken, yet understood by all, that the Dominion had made a grave mistake, for in trying to erase humanity, they had only awakened its wrath. The Galactic Council chamber glittered with cold light as humanity's envoys entered, their faces carved with grief and anger, but instead of sympathy, they were met with whispers, dismissive glances, and carefully chosen words that cut like blades, for the Council, composed of ancient species who claimed to be guardians of peace, repeated their stance with calm indifference. The loss of Erebos, Halcyon, and Vega Prime was not genocide, but the inevitable result of humanity's reckless expansion into territories the Dominion considered their own, and therefore no action would be taken. Ambassador Ilara, who had once believed in the Council's promises, rose to speak, her voice trembling not with fear, but with fury as she recounted the millions of lives erased. The families turned to ash, the children who had never even known war. Yet her pleas were met with silence, the great chamber echoing only with the faint hum of translation devices, until one counselor finally answered, his voice smooth and cold, declaring that humanity must learn its limits, lest the galaxy descend into chaos, words that sealed the betrayal in the hearts of all who heard them. When the envoys returned to Earth, they carried not treaties or promises, but the bitter truth that no help would come, and as their report spread, the final thread of trust humanity had held in the Council snapped, leaving behind only outrage and unity. For if the galaxy wished them to bow, they would rise instead. In underground bunkers and hidden stations, projects once forbidden began to accelerate, scientists unlocking technologies the Council had banned under the guise of peace, engineers reactivating orbital defense grids once buried beneath oceans and mountains, and cybernetic experts connecting themselves to the adaptive war network, an AI whose every second of thought equaled a year of strategy, weaving together tactics no enemy could anticipate. Even ordinary workers, farmers, and students found themselves drawn into the movement, not through coercion, but through choice. For every human knew that the faces of Erebos, Halcyon, and Vega Prime could just as easily have been their own, and that survival now demanded sacrifice. Yet as preparations grew, so too did the mystery of the Dominion's attack. For intelligence operatives uncovered fragments of intercepted transmissions suggesting that the genocide had not been a random strike, but part of a calculated design, a test of power meant to measure humanity's response. And this revelation chilled even the most hardened strategists, for it meant that the Dominion might be watching, still observing from the shadows, waiting to see whether humanity would cower or rise. In the Global Assembly, debates raged late into the nights, some urging caution, fearing that open defiance would invite annihilation, while others insisted that hesitation was death by another name, and the assembly hall shook with the voices of those who shouted for action, for justice, for retribution. Finally, the decision came not in words, but in an image, replayed again and again across the networks, the final moment of Commander Rin's transmission, where the Dominion flagship loomed above Erebos like a shadow blotting out the stars, and in that image humanity found its answer, a vow that this shadow would one day fall, and that when it did, the stars would remember who had cast it down. Fleets began to form in secret, built not in the open shipyards the Council monitored, but in hidden asteroids, in dark nebulae, in the ruins of long-abandoned stations, while spies spread rumors of weakness to mislead their enemies, and pilots trained in simulated battles drawn from the adaptive war network's endless calculations. Every victory and defeat absorbed into the AI's growing arsenal of knowledge. But beneath the determination lay a deeper tension, for every human knew that once they struck back, there would be no turning away, no possibility of returning to the fragile peace that had once defined their place in the galaxy, and that the path ahead would lead either to survival through strength or to extinction. Whispers passed through the ranks, soft but steady, that the galaxy had mistaken humanity's compassion for weakness, its patience for fear, but that soon they would remember what humanity had always carried within: the ability to endure, to adapt, and to rise stronger from every fall. In the night skies of Earth, the first of the new warships broke through the clouds, their hulls gleaming with strange alloys, their engines pulsing with blue light like the heartbeat of the planet itself. And as crowds gathered to watch, a silence swept through them, not of fear but of resolve, for in those ships they saw not just machines of war, but the embodiment of their wrath, silent for now, but soon to roar across the stars. In the hidden shipyards, carved into the cold rock of asteroid belts and veiled within nebula clouds, humanity's preparations reached a turning point, for the secret fleet they had built in silence now stirred to life. Engines igniting one by one, casting pale light across the darkness as though stars themselves were being born anew. And as the great vessels pulled free from their cradles, the adaptive war network hummed at the heart of their systems, connecting commanders, pilots, and crews in a vast web of thought and strategy, each decision flowing seamlessly into the next, a unity no enemy could anticipate. Yet despite the power gathering in the shadows, the Dominion did not strike again, and this absence weighed heavily on every human soul. For silence was often more terrifying than battle, leaving them to wonder whether the enemy was regrouping, planning, or simply watching with patient cruelty, waiting for the perfect moment to deliver another devastating blow. In command centers across Earth and the colonies that remained, officers trained day and night simulations drawn from every known Dominion tactic fed into the network, only for the AI to counter with strategies no human mind could have devised, teaching them how to adapt in seconds, how to turn weakness into strength, how to make every defeat a lesson instead of an end. Still, doubts lingered in quiet corners. Some whispered that no amount of preparation could overcome the sheer scale of the Dominion-S fleets. Others feared that the Council, though silent now, might one day intervene not against the Dominion, but against humanity itself, should they rise too far beyond what was permitted. For already reports trickled in that Council envoys were watching, their eyes narrow, their voices warning softly that Earth was awakening dangerous powers best left untouched. Yet for the people, the choice had already been made, and when the first trial deployment of the fleet was ordered, volunteers filled every crew roster in hours. Men and women who knew that the mission ahead might mean their deaths, but carried themselves with the resolve of those who had nothing left to lose. Their first test came sooner than expected, for a Dominion raiding party, small but deadly, appeared near the Vega shipping routes, perhaps sent to cut supply lines, or perhaps simply to test the waters of humanity's defense. And this time, when the enemy struck, they did not find helpless colonists, but warships forged from grief and vengeance, their captains linked by the network, their weapons charged with technologies the galaxy had long forbidden. The battle that followed was swift and brutal, the Dominion confident at first, their ships slicing through the void with practiced precision, but each attack was countered almost before it began, every maneuver anticipated by the network, every strike met with an equal and opposite blow until confusion spread among the Dominion ranks, their flawless coordination unraveling under the relentless adaptability of their foes. In less than an hour, the raiders were shattered, debris drifting silently through space. Their last transmissions garbled cries of disbelief that humans could fight with such precision, and though it was but a small victory, it sent ripples across the galaxy, for never before had the Dominion been repelled so decisively by those they considered weak. News spread quickly, whispered through smuggler networks, encoded in merchant signals, carried in the fearful reports of survivors, and the legend began to take shape. Humanity had awakened, and its wrath was no longer rumor but reality. On Earth, the victory was celebrated not with arrogance, but with quiet determination. For they knew the Dominion would not take the loss lightly, and that retaliation would be swift and merciless. Yet there was a fire now in every heart, a belief that they could stand, that they could fight, that they could turn tragedy into strength, and this fire burned brighter than fear. In the global assembly, leaders stood before their people and declared that humanity's age of silence was over, that the galaxy had mistaken compassion for weakness. But from this day onward, every star would know that humanity would endure, adapt, and answer every act of cruelty with unbreakable resolve. Still, even as the cheers filled cities and fleets prepared for the battles to come, shadows stirred in the distance, for the Dominion had heard of their loss and was gathering its strength, not to raid but to crush, and far beyond the reach of human sensors, colossal warships began to move. Their course set not for distant colonies but for Earth itself, where the heart of humanity waited unknowingly for the storm about to descend. The first true test came not in the quiet raids humanity had begun to repel, but in the roar of an armada that darkened the stars themselves, for the Dominion had gathered its strength at last and hurled it toward the cradle of humanity, a fleet so vast that its arrival blotted constellations from the night sky, and when the warning beacons flared above the outer rim, a shiver spread through every colony, every station, and every heart on Earth. The council remained silent, neither condemning nor assisting, watching as though this conflict were an experiment, a cruel spectacle played out for their judgment. But humanity had long ceased to look for their aid, and instead, the fleets they had forged in secret surged forward to meet the invaders, engines blazing like comets as they accelerated through the void, each vessel connected through the adaptive war network, their captains and crews bound by a web of thought that turned chaos into coordination, hesitation into precision. When the two forces met in the shadow of Titan's orbit, the first blasts of energy lit the darkness like storms of fire, shockwaves rippling through space as Dominion warships unleashed the full fury of their arsenal, beams slicing through the void, missiles bursting like artificial stars. Yet humanity did not scatter as expected, did not break beneath the sheer force of the assault, but instead moved as though guided by one mind, their ships shifting in flawless formations that bent around attacks, their counterstrikes timed with merciless accuracy, each maneuver a lesson learned from centuries of war, and each victory feeding into the network to shape the next. The Dominion, who had crushed empires with their numbers, found themselves facing an enemy who grew stronger with every second, whose very nature was to adapt, to survive, and to turn weakness into strength. And for the first time their confidence faltered, confusion spreading through their command as their ships fell in waves, burning wreckage scattering into Saturn's rings. Still, the battle was far from won, for the Dominion's flagship, larger than any vessel humanity had ever built, pressed forward, its weapons tearing through the network's defenses, annihilating entire squadrons with single volleys, its presence a reminder that no amount of strategy could erase the vast gulf in power, and as alarms screamed through the command decks, many feared that their victory at Vega had been nothing more than a spark doomed to be smothered. Yet amid the chaos, one captain, Admiral Kale, broke through the static of fear with a single order: divert power not to weapons but to data. Feed every strike, every defense, every failure directly into the network. Push it beyond its limits. And in that desperate gamble, the AI surged with new strength, absorbing the rhythm of the flagship's onslaught, predicting its moves before they happened, guiding human ships into patterns no living commander would have dared attempt, weaving them around the behemoth's weapons until for the first time its armor flared under concentrated fire. Hope sparked, faint but real, as the impossible became possible, yet the cost was heavy. ships torn apart in the effort, lives sacrificed in maneuvers that only worked because crews knew they would not return, their courage fueling the chance for survival. And in the silence of their loss, the rest of the fleet pressed on, hammering blow after blow into the monster until its shields flickered, its weapons stuttered, and at last a final barrage from Earth's newest dreadnought, the Resolute, pierced its core, sending the Dominion flagship into a slow, shuddering collapse that ended in a blinding burst of light, its wreckage scattered into the eternal dark. The battlefield fell into eerie quiet as the surviving Dominion ships broke formation and fled, their commanders unwilling to face an enemy that had accomplished the unthinkable, and in that silence humanity stood bloodied but unbroken, staring at the ruins of ships and the names of the fallen, knowing that though they had survived, the war was far from over. Across the galaxy, the legend of the Battle of Titan spread like wildfire. A tale of a species that should have been crushed, but instead had risen. A tale whispered with awe and fear alike, and in the council's chamber silence reigned once more. But this time it was not dismissal that filled the air. It was unease. For the great powers who had mocked humanity now saw what the Dominion had unleashed, and they began to wonder whether the wrath that had just been awakened could one day turn its gaze on them as well. The victory at Titan was not the end, but the beginning, for while the Dominion's retreat bought humanity a moment of breathing space, the Adaptive War Network calculated that waiting would only invite a larger assault, and so the decision was made not to defend passively, but to strike deep into enemy territory. A choice that shocked even their own leaders. For no species had ever dared to take the fight to the Dominion's worlds, yet humanity, bloodied but burning with resolve, prepared its fleets for the offensive. Across Earth and the surviving colonies, the scars of war remained visible. Families mourning the fallen, cities scarred from orbital bombardments. Yet in those scars there was no despair, only determination, for every loss fed into a fury that demanded justice, and soon the skies above Earth lit again with departing ships, thousands of engines igniting in unison as armadas leapt into hyperspace, their destination not trade routes or border patrols, but the heart of Dominion strongholds. The first strike came at the outpost of Narthis, a fortress that had stood unchallenged for centuries, where alien slaves labored under Dominion overseers, and massive shipyards churned out vessels to fuel the war machine. And when humanity's fleets arrived, the defenders expected another desperate resistance, yet instead they found themselves engulfed by a storm of coordinated assaults, precision strikes that targeted command hubs and fuel depots, maneuvers so unorthodox they shattered centuries of Dominion doctrine, and within hours the fortress burned, its overseers silenced, its enslaved inhabitants freed, staring in disbelief at their liberators. Word spread quickly through the galaxy. Humanity was not merely surviving, it was liberating, and this shifted the whispers from fear to hope, as species once resigned to Dominion rule began to imagine freedom. Still, the cost of such boldness was great, for each advance stretched supply lines, each victory demanded sacrifice, and every battle left empty seats at command tables. Names carved into memorials, yet none faltered, because the fire of Erebos, Halcyon, and Vega Prime still burned in their memory. As more strongholds fell, Dominion commanders grew desperate, deploying larger fleets, activating weapons forbidden even by their own council. Yet each confrontation only fed the Adaptive War Network with more knowledge, more patterns to exploit, until Dominion captains began to whisper that fighting humanity was like battling the void itself. Every strike absorbed, every tactic turned back upon them. In the council chambers, unease turned to alarm, for the very species they had once dismissed as reckless had now done what no member world had ever dared, toppling the unshakable Dominion, and the thought of what might happen if humanity ever turned that wrath upon them filled even the most ancient powers with a quiet fear they would not voice aloud. Still, for humanity, victory was not measured in fear or dominance, but in the sight of freed worlds. The voices of children no longer raised in chains, the faces of alien allies who had never before seen compassion in the eyes of conquerors, and yet with each triumph, the question grew heavier. Where would it end, and how far must they go before the Dominion was truly defeated? Admiral Cale, standing before the shattered map of Dominion space, understood what many dared not speak. The war would not end until humanity reached the Dominion capital itself, until the seat of their power was broken, for only then would the genocide be answered and the message made clear to every star. Preparations began in silence, fleets gathering in hidden sectors, weapons forged beyond anything humanity had yet unleashed. And at the center of it all, the adaptive war network pulsed like a living heart, guiding, calculating, adapting, but also growing in ways even its creators could no longer fully predict. A reminder that humanity's greatest strength carried its own shadows. Yet there was no turning back, no room for hesitation, for the path ahead was carved in the blood of the fallen and the cries of the freed. And as the armadas set their course toward the Dominion's throne world, the galaxy watched in silence, holding its breath, knowing that whatever came next would decide not only the fate of humanity and the Dominion, but the balance of power across every star, and that the storm humanity had become was now unstoppable. The march of humanity reached its final destination. At last the Dominion capital, a world long cloaked in shadows and dread its skies blackened by war factories, and its orbit guarded by fleets so vast that even the most powerful civilizations of the Council had once trembled at the sight yet as the human armadas emerged from hyperspace, their engines burning like a sunrise across the void. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only the steady rhythm of unity. For every ship, every soldier, every mind was bound together by the adaptive war network, a living thread of resolve woven from grief, sacrifice, and hope. The Dominion unleashed its full fury, swarms of warships, surging forth planetary cannons roaring fire across the heavens. Weapons forbidden by ancient treaties searing through the dark, yet the humans pressed on, weaving formations so fluid they seemed alive, every maneuver answering the enemy before it was made, every sacrifice calculated to open a path closer to the world that had ordered their people's extinction. And slowly, against all reason, the impossible battle began to tilt. On the surface, as human strike teams descended through storms of fire, they found cities built not as homes but as cages, towering spires of cruelty where enslaved species toiled without hope. And when those chains were broken, when the captives saw the banners of humanity unfurl against the burning sky, their cries shook the air, voices of freedom rising louder than the weapons around them. Above, Admiral Cale led the assault from the bridge of the Resolute, his gaze fixed not on the countless ships still surrounding them, but on the great spire at the heart of the Dominion capital, the seat of power from which orders of genocide had been given. And with every strike, every fallen comrade, he felt the weight of what must come next, for vengeance alone was not enough. This had to be an ending, not just for humanity's pain, but for the cycle of fear that had bound the galaxy for centuries. As the last Dominion flagship fell in a blaze of shattered metal and silence, the network guided the fleet into orbit above the world, their cannons poised, their wrath at its peak, and for a moment it seemed as if humanity might deliver the same annihilation that had been dealt to Erebos, Halcyon, and Vega Prime. But then the order came clear and steady to hold fire to land, to take not vengeance but justice. And in that moment, humanity revealed a truth the Dominion and the Council alike had never understood. Wrath did not mean cruelty, power did not mean conquest, and survival did not demand the extinction of others. The Dominion leaders were captured, their fortresses dismantled, their weapons destroyed, and their enslaved worlds set free. A liberation no other species had ever dared attempt. And when at last Admiral Cale stood before the cameras that broadcast across every star system, his words were simple, yet carried the weight of fire and steel. We sought peace, and you gave us genocide. We sought trust, and you gave us betrayal. Know this: the stars will remember what you unleashed, and they will remember what we became. Humanity does not forgive genocide. Never again shall we bow. Never again shall we remain silent. His message rippled through the galaxy like thunder, shaking ancient halls and echoing in every corner where fear had once ruled. And in that silence the council trembled, for they understood that the balance had shifted, that the species they had dismissed as fragile had risen into something they could no longer control, something that inspired both hope and dread. Yet humanity did not linger to claim thrones or carve empires, for when the Dominion's chains were broken, they turned instead to rebuilding, to restoring, to proving that their wrath was not blind destruction, but the fire that cleared the way for life to begin anew. And though the scars of Erebos, Halcyon, and Vega Prime would never fade, their memory became a vow etched into every heart, that never again would genocide go unanswered, and never again would humanity be underestimated. As their fleets returned home, battered but unbroken, the galaxy whispered of the storm that had risen, a storm born of loss but carried by resilience. And though many feared what humanity might one day become, none could deny the truth. They had faced annihilation, and instead of fading, they had carved their name into the stars, not as victims, but as a people whose wrath had changed the fate of the galaxy forever.